In our lesson today, we're beginning a new series on the dangers that exist on the safe side. Now, what do we mean by that? When we use that phrase, on the safe side, what does that mean? Well, one dictionary defined this as being especially careful to avoid something unpleasant. Another dictionary defined this as avoiding danger with a margin for error. And that pointed out that this idiom was first used in 1811. So this has been in use in our culture for about 200 years, where we talk about being on the safe side of something, that we make decisions because we want to stay on the safe side. Sometimes this is fine to do. Sometimes it's even wise to do. But we need to understand there's a difference between wisdom and safety. Sometimes they overlap, but sometimes they don't. We as disciples, followers of Christ, we are called to be wise or prudent, but we're not always going to be safe. Jesus hasn't called us to be safe. He's called us to follow Him. Sometimes when we make decisions because we want to stay on the safe side, it actually puts us in a dangerous position where erring on the side of caution actually causes us to err, that we find ourselves in error. It can lead to fear, it can lead to compromise, and all of this can stem from a lack of faith, especially when we're talking about spiritual matters. And that's what we're going to be looking at in this series. How we need to avoid simply making decisions based on, what seems safe. Well, we want to err on the side of caution. What is safe? What are we to do? So we're going to decide that. Faithfulness to the Lord is often going to require us to venture out of safety. We have to do the will of God regardless of what the consequences are. And so in this series, we're going to talk about dangers that exist when we don't want to put ourselves out there, when we try to shield ourselves from every negative consequence that we might see. So we stay on the safe side. We're going to look at why this is appealing, why this is dangerous, and what we should do instead. The first of these we're going to talk about is how we might err on the side of caution, so-called. We might stay on the safe side by avoiding anything controversial. We don't want to get involved in controversy. We don't want to do that because we want to be on the side of caution. We want to be safe. This was what happened over in Galatians chapter 2. Galatians chapter 2, beginning in verse 11, Paul said, "But when Cephas came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face, because he stood condemned. For prior to the coming of certain men from James, he used to eat with Gentiles. But when they came, he began to withdraw and hold himself aloof, fearing the party of the circumcision. The rest of the Jews joined with him in hypocrisy, with the result that even Barnabas was carried away by their hypocrisy. But when I saw that they were not straightforward about the truth of the gospel, I said to Cephas in the presence of all, 'If you, being a Jew, live like the Gentiles and not like the Jews, how is it that you compel the Gentiles to live like Jews?'" Here we have Paul speaking of the time where he needed to confront Cephas, or the name that we're more familiar with for this individual is Peter. He had to confront him because he says there that Cephas, or Peter, used to eat with the Gentiles, which is what he should have been doing. This was right. Christ came to bring all together. So he should have done that, and he used to do that. This was right to do, and he knew it was right. Over in Acts chapter 10, when Peter went to the household of Cornelius, when he went there, had to be convinced by God that he should go, because this was not something that the Jews would do. They would not eat with Gentiles. And over in Acts chapter 10 and verse 28, when he finally went, he said to them, "You yourselves know how unlawful it is for a man who is a Jew to associate with a foreigner or to visit him, and yet God has shown me that I should not call any man unholy or unclean." According to the Jewish laws and their culture, this was not something he should have been doing. But he recognized God was showing him this. God revealed to him that you are not to call anyone unholy or unclean, that you can and you ought to associate with the Gentiles, with those who need the gospel. Well, when he returned to Jerusalem in the next chapter, in Acts chapter 11, he came to Jerusalem in verse 2. Those who were circumcised took issue with him, saying, "You went to uncircumcised men and ate with them." But Peter began speaking and proceeded to explain to them in orderly sequence, then goes on and explains everything that had happened. And so he says there in verse 17, this was the conclusion. "Therefore, if God gave to them the same gift he gave to us also after believing in the Lord Jesus, who was I that I could stand in God's way?" It wasn't his place to say that, well, no, Gentiles are not acceptable. Gentiles need to be avoided. God has accepted them. So he needed to accept them as well. So Peter, or Cephas here, he knew what was right. He knew it was right to associate with the Gentiles and to eat with them. But when certain men arrived, certain men from James, it says he withdrew. And he gave the reason there. He feared the party of the circumcision. Well, who were these individuals? Well, these were Jewish Christians who would require Gentile Christians to be circumcised and to keep the law of Moses. Well, Paul had already, just a few verses earlier in this letter in Galatians 2, talked about how he opposed this very publicly. Galatians chapter 2, verse 3, it says, "Not even Titus, who was with me, though he was a Greek, was compelled to be circumcised. But it was because of the false brethren secretly brought in to sneaked in to spy out our liberty, which we have in Christ Jesus, in order to bring us into bondage. But we did not yield in subjection to them for even an hour, so that the truth of the gospel would remain with you." This was a controversial subject there in the first century. And Paul says, we weren't going to just stand by and just let them say whatever they're going to say, or force these Gentiles, like Titus, to be circumcised when the law of Christ did not compel them, did not require them to be circumcised. So Paul opposed this. Peter, though, he did not want to stand up to these individuals. He just wanted to just let everything go, just not cause any trouble, not rock the boat. And so he just went along with them. And others, Paul said, including Barnabas, they were carried away. And the problem with this, by compromising in this way, what Peter was doing was that he was not being straightforward about the truth of the gospel. He was not being honest about what the gospel meant, about what it required, and how we live up to the gospel. He was not being straightforward about that. But why would, for someone like Peter, why would it have seemed safe? Well, we want to remain on the safe side, and we'll just go along with these Jewish Christians. We won't associate with the Gentiles right now because they're not circumcised. Why would that be seen by him as safe? The reason is because it would preserve his relationship with them. It would preserve his reputation among them, those of the party of the circumcision. He needed to appear right to them, rather than face all the trouble that would come by doing something that didn't match up and fall along the party lines. This happens even today, that even in the church, even among brotherhood, you have people lining up along party lines. And if you don't line up with what the party says, then there'll be all sorts of trouble for you. Peter's, well, I would stay on the safe side. I don't want to cause any trouble. I don't want to have an issue here, so I'll just go along with them. He wanted to avoid controversy. Why is this tempting? Why is it tempting for us to avoid controversy like this? Well, the reason is because controversy is demanding. It requires us, as Jude 3 says, to contend earnestly for the faith. And if we are going to contend, which that word means to do battle, that requires preparation on our part. Ephesians 6 talks about how we put on the full armor of God. That all these different pieces, as we gird our belt, put on the belt of truth, we have the breastplate of righteousness, we have our feet shod with the preparation of the gospel of peace, the shield of faith, the helmet of salvation, the sword of the Spirit, all these things we put on. That's preparation. That's training. It's demanding to be involved in this type of battle, to contend for the faith. It's tempting to say, well, I just don't want to be involved in that. Taking a stand. Why is it tempting to just not get involved? Taking a stand requires decisiveness. We have to know what we believe, not just have a vague idea of what we believe. We have to know what we believe. As 1 Peter 3:15 says, we have to be ready to give an answer for the hope that is in us. Not just, well, I would like to think this, or I've been told this. We have to know what is right. And that requires us to study. 2 Timothy 2:15 says we are to study to show ourselves approved to God. That takes diligence on our part. But it's tempting to not get involved because, well, we have to take a stand. And taking a stand makes us a target. It's another reason why it's tempting to just not get involved and avoid controversy. We don't want to be a target. Paul, as we already saw, he was willing to stand up. He was not going to back down. And when he was on trial after being arrested, he said in 2 Timothy 4:16 that at his first offense, no one supported him. Everyone deserted him. Sometimes people won't take a stand with us. We might be targeted because we will stand for what is right. Sometimes those that we would expect or hope would stand with us, they may not do that. We may be left to stand alone. So we'll be targeted, and sometimes we won't have the support that we thought we would. So it's tempting to say, well, I'm just not going to stand up. I'm just not going to get involved. It seems safer just to not say anything. It's tempting to do that. Why is it dangerous to do that? Because if we will not stand up, error will just spread unchecked. Paul explained over in 2 Timothy chapter 2, and using an analogy, he explained just how error spreads. Over in 2 Timothy chapter 2 and verses 16 through 18, he said, but avoid worldly and empty chatter, for it will lead to further ungodliness, and their talk will spread like gangrene, or some translations say like cancer. Among them are Hymenaeus and Philetus. So he mentions these two individuals. Why would he call them out? Well, he explains here in verse 18, men who have gone astray from the truth, saying that the resurrection has already taken place, and they upset or overthrow the faith of some. When error spreads like this, and we just let it go, think, well, I don't want to get involved. It spreads like cancer. We all know how cancer works. That it spreads throughout someone's body. Unless there's some treatment that will stop it or kill it, it will continue to spread throughout someone's body until it eventually kills them. That's what he's describing here. Their talk will spread like gangrene or like cancer. These ones who were followers of Christ, but now their faith has been upset because here you have Hymenaeus and Philetus saying, well, no, the resurrection's already passed. You missed it. And so then what are they hoping for? They don't have anything. And so their faith is overthrown. So why is it dangerous to just avoid controversy and not take a stand? Error will spread unchecked, and truth will be abandoned by some people. It could be that they will gradually drift away from it, as Hebrews 2 and verse 1 warns about. That we drift away from what we've already heard and already been taught. Or it could be, surprisingly sometimes, a quick desertion from the truth. Galatians 1, 6, and 7, Paul said that I marvel that you are so quickly deserting him who called you by the grace of God for a different gospel. You are so quickly turning away, which, as he explained, was not another, but some have perverted the gospel of Christ. They've corrupted it and changed it. Why would they follow after it? Well, in some cases, there wasn't anyone before Paul wrote this letter to stand up for the truth. And so they quickly desert what they had held on to. Others might slowly drift away from it. But when error goes unchecked, when those who teach the truth refuse to get involved in controversy, there will be some who abandon the truth. Either quickly or slowly, there will be some who abandon the truth. And then we end up jeopardizing our soul. You have the example of Ezekiel in Ezekiel chapter 3, who was called as a watchman for God's people. And this principle is still helpful for us today because it shows what we are responsible to do with the information that we have from God. Over in Ezekiel chapter 3 and verse 17, he says, Son of man, I have appointed you a watchman to the house of Israel. Whenever you hear a word from my mouth, warn them from me. When I say to the wicked, you will surely die, and you do not warn him, or speak out to warn the wicked from his wicked way that he may live, that wicked man shall die in his iniquity. But his blood I will require at your hand. If you just don't want to get involved, you don't want to say anything, you don't want to rock the boat, well, you don't say what's coming. It says he's going to die in his sin, but you are going to be held responsible for your silence. This is dangerous. We cannot just say, well, all this controversy that exists around us, we just don't want to get involved. There are foolish controversies out there that we should not get involved in, but it comes to what God has revealed in His Word. And people are being led astray from that. We can't just say that, well, we shouldn't get involved. So what should we do instead? Instead of avoiding controversy, what should we do? Well, rather than allowing error to spread unchecked, we need to help silence false teachers. Over in Titus 1, as Paul described the work of elders in the church, he said in verse 9 that they are to hold fast the faithful word which is in accordance with the teaching, so that he will be able to both exhort in sound doctrine and refute those who contradict. Those who are causing these controversies, they need to be refuted. Why? Verse 10, there are many rebellious men, empty talkers and deceivers, especially those of the circumcision, who must be silenced because they are upsetting whole families, teaching things they should not teach for the sake of sordid gain. They are upsetting others, and not just causing them to be upset as we think of that term, but going back to what we read in 2 Timothy chapter 2, they are overthrowing the faith of some. They must be silenced. We can't just let error just go and just ignore it, because it has a damaging effect on others. False teachers need to be silenced when they have influence over those in the church, rather than sitting back while some abandon the truth. We need to contend for the faith. We already mentioned that verse in Jude 3. Contend for the faith. Earnestly do that, and encourage others to do the same. That's what Paul was doing in 2 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 3 when he told the young evangelist, suffer hardship with me as a good soldier of Christ Jesus. You are involved in this fight too. Paul was standing for the truth. He told Timothy, you stand for the truth. We need to encourage each one of us that we all stand for the truth. Some are abandoning the faith or will abandon the faith. We need to contend for the faith and encourage others to stand in the fight together. And rather than jeopardizing our soul with silence, We need to declare the whole counsel of God. Paul said over in Acts chapter 20, when he was meeting with the elders from the church at Ephesus, he said in verse 26, "Therefore I testify to you this day that I am innocent of the blood of all men." How could he say that? Verse 27, "For I did not shrink from declaring to you the whole purpose," or the whole counsel of God. He was innocent before God because he did not hold anything back that they needed to hear. When controversy arose, he was willing to teach the truth and refute error. He was innocent of the blood of all men. We need to be willing to do the same thing. Controversy is not pleasant. We all understand that. No one enjoys getting involved in controversy, at least no one with a good, honest heart. There are some people who have a morbid interest in debates and things like that, but no one with a good heart enjoys controversy, but it exists. And we need to be willing to take a stand for the truth, because truth is truth. Even if some people find it controversial, it is still the truth. And we need to believe the truth, teach the truth, and practice the truth in order to be saved, because that's the only way to be pleasing to God. So while it might be tempting to think that, well, it'll be easier if we just don't get involved in all of these controversial things. It will be easier if we just sit by and be silent. We're going to stay on the safe side. Sometimes the safe side is not really safe. Certainly sometimes it's not right. We need to be willing to take a stand for the truth, no matter what others think about it. Stand for the truth. Believe it, teach it, and practice it. Because ultimately what we're trying to do is please the Lord and encourage others to do the same.